Today's guest is Peter von Irle.
I think that's just that's the nature of the world right now, though, right? Is like
Yeah.
there's there's so much like evolutionary change that's going on that for those of us that are truly awake and we're questioning at all times, like, why do I believe what I believe? And we're genuinely honest and we're searching, we're seeking,
Mhm.
we're realizing that the things that were baked in to our metaphysical and epistemological worldview when we were younger are kind of bullcrap.
You're listening to the Bad at My Religion podcast, hosted by Josh God.
And so, it's like, I mean, even like the latest Khazarian talk I gave in uh in Buenos Aires was
Mhm.
even an evolution from the one I gave, which was 3 times as freaking long and was totally scriptural based, was as long as the one I gave in Istanbul, because I'm still finding things and it's like, holy shnikes. And even then, there was a total new mic drop moment where it was like, and I didn't even see this. I swear this is seriously just the creator going like, knock, knock, here it is. Where I had come up with the idea of a new. Do you mind if I talk about this?
Absolutely. Whatever you want to talk about. I've got a bunch of questions, but let's
Okay.
just
So
conversation.
I mean, this just really ties into being bad at my religion, so to speak. So I think it's a fascinating seg.
So wait, but before you do that, just so I don't have to edit and chop things up and move it around. Um, how did you get there from where you started? The really short version, it doesn't have to be. We'll get into many things, I'm sure, like talking and in future talks or whatever. Um, but like the 3 minute version of how you grew up and then how you got to where you are right now. Let's start with that to sort of set the stage for everything else that comes after. And also include in that where you are now, maybe like the elevator pitch of what's your faith or what's your religious belief or your spirituality or your philosophical framework
Yep,
encompasses at this stage. Yep.
sure. So grew up in an incredibly dogmatic fundamentalist home, and I mean, we weren't allowed to play sports on Sunday, kind of fundamentalists. Ironically, picked the wrong dang day. And I mean, not allowed to listen to any music with a beat because that's Satan's music, kind of like really, really fundamentalist. Not allowed to date, come to the United States and was like, not just don't smoke, don't chew, don't go with girls that do, but like literally not allowed to date in high school, like homecoming king, not allowed to go to my own dang formal kind of thing, right? And for whatever crazy reason, I was like the good boy and was like, okay, I guess I'm just like gonna follow what dad says, even though it was like so wound up and screwed up. And so that was the inception point, let's just say.
Mhm.
And then went through a faith journey when I was an undergrad with one of my roommates. And our sophomore year, he ended up winning a Truman Scholarship, I believe, which is like the top 100 philosophy students in the world. When
Oh well.
Chad, yeah, so he was smart. So he won a either Truman or Roosevelt, I can't remember. Anyway, it's the top 100 philosophy students. He won that the same year that I won a Fulbright, and got nominated for it, but did not win a Rhodes. And anyway, the we went through and deconstructed every major world religion. So we like took the ideas of Francis Derrida that we took from one of Steve Meyer's classes, incidentally, who's now killing it with Discovery Institute and has been on Piers and Rogan. Is just so anyway, he was our buddy because he was just like this young, cool professor at the time. And Stephen C. Meyer. And so we said, well, why don't we do this? Let's see what we can figure out. So we deconstructed every major world religion, and what we really came up to or came back with was this: there are logically, we either need to be nihilistic or we need to believe that there is a some sort of a monotheistic creator, because everything else rationally breaks down. I don't have time to get into all that right now, why pantheism really doesn't work from a logical point of view, just using logical syllogisms.
Mhm.
and why atheism doesn't work. Just without getting too deep into it, I mean, I'd love to have a conversation about it at some point, maybe, but why it just does not work logically.
Yeah.
And so for us, for me, I was a nihilist for a year. And I was like, and the whole idea, like taking existentialism to the nth degree. And so I was, I guess, 19 probably at the time. And so the whole idea, Jean-Paul Sartre's idea of looking into the abyss and seeing what comes back at you. And that for me was kind of just like, meh. And I remember, like, it wasn't that I was suicidal, but I just did a lot of stupid crap during the time period just because it was like, oh, I don't care. Like, if we had this clockmaker God who left us to our own devices, then what do I care? Like, well, what's the whole point? It really takes Solomon's idea of existentialism with vanity in the Song of Songs, or not Song of Songs, but in
Ecclesiastes.
Ecclesiastes, thank you. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. Dust in the wind, all of these ideas that are truly existentialist. And so looking at that and saying, like, I really don't care. And then coming back around and saying, when I was, I guess it was the end of my junior year, so I was must have been 20, just turned 20. No, sorry, I was 20, but it was it was the beginning of my senior year. And looking and saying, I remember where I was, and I was carrying two big sheets of 5/8 plywood on my head, like above my head, right? Those things are not light.
Yeah.
And I was walking around with them because I was, I don't know, framing. It was like right before the beginning of school. And so I remember saying, I was like, just kind of threw up this popcorn prayer. And I was like, if you're real, like, show me the answer to this problem of evil. And it wasn't, because this is what, for me, it said, you know what, I'm rejecting at this time the idea of not just fundamentalism, but the idea of this sort of creator God that is all loving. And the reason for that was this: it wasn't the Augustinian problem of evil where God is good, God is all powerful, and there's evil in this world. How do you reconcile that? That's really easy. That's just free will, right? So it's like God can be good and God can be all powerful, and there can still be evil in this world because God gives us free will, and so we choose to do something that is, well, while we're here in the sim, and I believe that's at that point, while we're here in the sim, we we choose to do things that are evil, but that doesn't mean that God is evil. So the whole Augustinian conundrum wasn't the issue. The issue was, well, where did that evil come from? And so when you believe that, so my definition at that time was the ability to create ex nihilo. Ex nihilo meaning in Greek, be able to create from nothing. And so looking at a creator that can create tabula rasa, so to speak. So that is blank slate. I'm not talking about in a vacuum. I mean truly ex nihilo. And this is the problem that atheists have, is coming back and saying, okay, well, Big Bang, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, well, where'd that come from? And so what you end up with is this problem that Thomas Aquinas defined with infinite causal chains, where it's like the unmoved mover is more logical than that is, it's more logical to believe there's an unmoved mover than that there is A begets C, B begets C, beget D, beget E ad infinitum, because then that in itself becomes God. And that's crazy. That is, when you define God using these logical syllogisms. Thank you, Dr. Meyer. And so anyway, so looking at that, and this is again as a 19-year-old, this is a 20-year-old maybe, looking at that and then saying, I believe these definitions. And this, frankly, came out of core classes that I ended up teaching the semester after I took them. I think I was the first student to ever do that at Whitworth. I mean, I was like 19 teaching like these classes, and it was crazy, but it was awesome. And so anyway, so in terms of looking back, and I still remember this crap like it was yesterday. I mean, I didn't think about this before. It was just like tracing this back. So looking back and then saying like, okay, so where do we go from here? This summer, again, going into my senior year in undergrad, where do we go, and what does this look like? I believe that there's this problem. Oh, and the problem is this. Sorry, I kind of meandered there for a minute. The problem is this. It's not the Augustinian problem of evil. It's the problem of evil being created from nothing. So when we say there is, so the ability to create means that God created it, or a God. We either have a pantheistic system where that entity, that being that created evil becomes God per se, or a God. And I'm not talking about an Elohim sort of watcher, but a truly a God.
Right.
Or else our good God created evil. And how does that work?
Exactly. Which is the question that most religious people, at least on the Christian side or Jehovah's Witness or Mormon, like really don't like to address, in my experience.
Agree. So I actually talked to Ron Mell about this. And I asked a bunch of professors at Whitworth, because that's where I was, like to explain this, and there wasn't a good answer. And I was asking smart guys,
Mm-hmm.
and there wasn't a satisfactory answer. And I asked Ron, who was like, got nominated for I think Times Man of the Year, and was like had the biggest mega church in Oregon at that point, and he didn't give me a good answer either. No disrespect to Ron Mell, well, love the guy, but he just didn't give me. It was just he circled around it. So anyway, so I was just kind of popcorned this thing up because I'm like, there's got to be an answer. And so I clear as day, I'll never forget this. I'll never forget where I was and what I was carrying. And, and just as clear as day, the answer, and it still kind of makes me a little bit emotional. The answer was, well, I created it. And that doesn't make me any less divine. I created everything. And it's in Isaiah. And just because I created evil, because I'm all loving, I can create the antithesis of what I am because I created everything. But that doesn't mean I practice it. And that's the whole point of this sim, at least in my worldview. That's the point of this sim that we're in now, where everything truly is electric. And then the corollary to electricity is electromagnetism, and everything else is just kind of there. And so, and we believe this, for we being, I mean, you and I, but this is something that came from our grandma, maternal grandma, who, I mean, when we were kids, was talking about the body electric and how everything is electricity and as above, so below, and all of these sorts of ideas that she got from our great grandpa, who was pen pals with Einstein and a bunch of other interesting people. Right? And I'll still got those letters, as you know. And at that point, ironically, our biological dad was like, she's a Satanist, and like, don't listen to her. And
Yeah.
yet I had all these conversations with her when I was in, I talked to her a bunch, because she would call me, I talked to her probably 3-4 times a week in undergrad and law school.
That's awesome.
And
I really wish that I had more of a chance to get to know her. I was the youngest of all the cousins, and at the time, like when I spent a lot of time with her was like 11, 12, 13, kind of in those years when she came down to live with us.
yep,
And it was the same thing. It was because mom and dad were both so against everything that she talked about and did and studied and whatever, that it's like, I mean, I've told you the story, but like it was when I was probably 30, 31, when it really hit me in the bottom of a pool in the Osa Peninsula, and I was like, Grandma was right. And then from there, like that's, I mean, it's been quite a journey over the last decade. But
yep.
so yeah, I kind of regret that, but that's amazing. That's probably why, your worldview then at that time was so much more advanced, in undergrad, was because of the things that she was talking to you about, which like now it's a little like we've seen over the last couple of years, I think it's become more common to even discuss some of those topics, but 20 years ago it was not.
No, not at all. And it really is one of those things, referring back to, great philosophers and theologians, is the whole idea of a priori versus a posteriori knowledge, right? Immanuel Kant talks about this, and he's like, standing on the shoulders of giants I've seen over the wall. And I give so much credit to her and to a couple of great professors that I had, that I was able to see this stuff so early. It wasn't me. It was the whole idea of, don't think you're born on third base and you hit a freaking triple, because you didn't.
Right.
And so I did not hit a triple. I didn't hit anything. I was blessed with a crap ton, and it's my obligation to do something good with it.
So how did
But
you go then from there, then through undergrad, and then through your adult life, let's call it, and those changes that have brought you to the place where you are now?
it's only been, I would say it's the last, well, there's been a couple of other awakenings. So there was this geopolitical awakening as well, and this is also during that same time period. And it was also in large part thanks to our paternal grandma, and who told me that a lot of what we in the West had believed post World War II was just made up. And of course, great grandpa von Earl was a freaking stud in South America. And he was Admiral Byrd's radio contact on that last trip, right? In addition to doing a crap ton of other stuff. And so grandma told me real early on all these stories about how the Nazis aren't the way they were portrayed and how the Antarctica was warm and all this stuff. And I was just like, I'm hearing this from her on the one side, and then reading all this stuff where it's like grandma's a kook basically on the other.
Right.
And yet, now we see that, yeah, sure enough, that's all getting proven to be true. And so I had seen that really early on. She'd given me a book when I was, I don't know, I think it was in law school about the Havara Accords. I don't know if I can say that without you getting censored. But anyway.
Well, I guess we'll find out.
All right. So I'll be careful not to say any buzzwords too much. But
no,
anyway.
whatever. I'm gonna put it on. I'm gonna publish on Rumble, and then I don't think they censor podcasts as much, especially given the topic of religion or philosophy. I think you're allowed more on audio, but we'll find out.
Fair enough. So anyway, the Havara Accord. So yeah, so looking at that and then saying like, how does that coincide with the idea of dispensationalism, right? Where the Protestant church per se believes that the Israel we know today is these are quote God's chosen people. Mm-hmm. And how does that tie in with let's call it the last seculum of history, right? The last long 80-ish year cycle, 85-year cycle, I guess now. And so looking at that 20 years ago was like, I didn't really, that was the one hot topic for the longest period of time. I don't want to say to anybody. It was like, I didn't want to be labeled a white supremacist. I'm like, I'm not a white supremacist. I just know this whole thing is bullcrap. Like, this didn't happen like this. And here's why. But I've got a couple of those books I was looking at the other day in my library from forever ago. And so anyway, looking at that and saying, okay, from a geopolitical point of view, who really controls the world? And then I was our friend, Dr. Will, that I was right after law school, that had turned me on to the books of Jasher and the book Enoch. And I'd read those with great intrigue, especially Jasher, several times. And I went, wait a minute, why did this get pulled out of the Bible? Because if the Bible, that is the 66 books that are in the current Bible, 6 is being their number. And so then I started digging into the Council of Nicaea, 313, looking at that, and then saying, wait a minute, so why did all of these church fathers get like thrown into the Colosseum and burned at the stake and, eaten by lions and all this stuff, if this is true? And so this was at the time period, I don't know, it was like after law school, let's call it maybe 20, 25, 26, 27 maybe, where it was like, I realized the whole Christmas thing was just, not that I don't like Christmas, I'm not bah-humbug. It's just the symbols are all freaking pagan as they get, right? It's
like, you know what? I remember that phase because the book that I got was from one of Will's friends. What was the guy's name? I forget the name. He's like the really famous guy that wrote all those. You talk about him all the time.
Dr.
Horowitz?
Lynn Horowitz. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I remember reading that because I loved Christmas, and like I think I put Christmas year round in my yearbook quote or something in high school. And then a couple years later, I read that book because you guys were talking about that, and I'm like, oh wow, Christmas is like the church just ripped it off of all the like sun solstice and winter solstice and like pagan.
Yeah, exactly.
It's crazy.
So that
and that wasn't very popular to talk about.
Oh, exactly. So that was a long time ago for us. So that came from Horowitz. And incidentally, I was actually Joby, of all people, who's doing well now again, was Joby, who was friends with Dr. Horowitz, because they had places like they were neighbors, I think, in Beaver Creek, and then they also had places like close to each other in Hawaii. So Joby had introduced us. Yeah, and so like reading about structured water, understanding
Mhm.
the numbers, 538, 432, all those sorts of
The
things,
hertz and
right?
how that affects the water also in the cell. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. So this started weaving into the worldview back, and this is like, again, my late 20s. And so then attempting to reconcile, well, how does this work where I don't believe that, I mean, I like Christmas, it's fun. I like decorating for Christmas and singing old Christmas carols, and this is fun. It's fun. But
Uh-huh.
the bottom line is that I know this tree is a freaking Asherath pole. I know that the earth died on the 20 in the northern hemisphere, at least on the 23rd of December. 24th, you don't really see a difference. So of course, Christmas Eve, the morning of the 25th, is when you notice the difference on the freaking sundial. And tracing that back, that traces back to Nimrod. And I can read, and I read the book of Jasher. So I read the book of Jasher. I know Jasher 7. I know his wife is, Semiramis. And I know that that after um, Esau kills Nimrod, who's 200 and something years old at that point, who has the cloak that God made to Adam when he kicked Adam and Eve out of the garden, killed some animals, gave him this coat, and then Adam gave it, I believe, to Seth, who gave it to Enoch, who gave it to Methuselah, who gave it to Noah, and then Ham stole it out of the ark and gave it to Cush, who gave it to Nimrod. And then Nimrod suddenly, grows this huge and suddenly becomes this occultic thing and builds the Tower of Babel 1. And all of these things happen. And he lives a really long time, and he's the first king after the floods, right? So we see this whole story in Jasher. And maybe the whole, like I was saying, my Khazarian talks, maybe the whole thing's nonsense. But the sure ties together. And billions of people believe it. And all the major world religions, sans maybe Hinduism, that sans the Asian religions, so to say, believe this.
Mhm.
So anyway, so tying this, I promise I'll bring this all around full circle.
No, it's
So
interesting.
I believe all of this stuff in my late 20s, and I'm like, well, okay, so Marduk is born of a virgin, the virgin being Semiramis, and that's because Esau, when he's a kid, goes out. He's 15 or 16 years old. This is the Book of Jasher, and all this stuff is gutted by the Council of Nicaea. Jasher is gutted, even though it's referenced twice in the Old Testament saying, for more information about this, go check out the Book of Jasher.
Mhm.
Now, why would I say, hey, if I'm writing a history in Chronicles or Deuteronomy or whatever, and I say, hey, for more information on this, go check out this great big thick book. Would I do that if it was bullcrap? Of course
Right.
not. That's nuts. I'd say,
Right.
go check out the historical record because that's the really bad. I mean, bad being good, the great historical record. It's a lot more dense. So looking at that and saying, okay, so here's the true story of why Esau sold his birthright. I promise this comes full circle. So Esau sells his birthright. Why? Because he's been out in the fields all day. He's 15 or 16 years old, and he sneaks up, according to the book of Jasher, chapter 7, I believe. He sneaks up on Nimrod, who's 200 and something years old, and he sees he's got the cloak, and he's only got two of his bodyguards with him, and he sneaks up, has a major fight with him, he kills him, and steals his cloak. Then he comes back and he's famished, and the whole troops are coming after him, and he's running and he's hiding or whatever. And he finally gets home, and his foo-foo brother, Jacob, later Israel, is making some stew. Now, mind you, Esau has just, I promise this all ties into the whole world religion thing. Esau has just killed the king of the universe at this point, basically. The king of the world, Nimrod, is 200 something years old.
What was his motive?
Power?
Oh, okay.
There was no, I mean, there was no motive. Well, actually, that's not true. There is a motive. I'll get back to that in a second. Let me finish telling this whole birthright story. I'll get back to it.
Okay.
Okay. So Esau staggers home. Jacob's making some stew out of lentils. They're red. And so red beans. And Esau says, bro, give me some food. And Jacob says, well, what are you going to give me for it? He's the younger twin. And Esau goes like, basically, F you, I'm dying, I'm starving. And he's also, think about this. He just basically dunked on Michael Jordan times 10.
Uh-huh.
So he's like 15, 16 years old. He goes out and whoops the king of the world at this point and kills he and his two bodyguards. And he stole the cloak that they all know the story that God made for Adam. Now he's got this. He's feeling all powerful. And so Jacob's like, well, how about give me your birthright? And Esau's like, mother effer, I don't care about my damn birthright. I just killed the king of the world and I got his coat. Like, I'm magic now. This fool made the Tower of Babel. We're in this thing. And like had a pet lion or tiger or whatever, did all this crazy stuff and lived 250 years. What's my birthright? And the only part that's in the Torah still is the whole part about what's my birthright. But it skips out all of the backstory, which is so
Ah,
fascinating.
interesting. Are there other historical records that also allude to that or tell the story?
Not that I know of, not that story, just Jasher in detail.
Okay.
But here is a little bit more of the allegory, and this is told in other places. So when Nimrod was, I think I believe 100 years old, he had a dream. You're going to recognize this story, talking about allegory throughout the course of the scriptures. He had a dream that a star came out of the east. Now, mind you, Jasher predates all of these other historical prophets that are in the Bible by a lot. He had a dream that a star came out of the east and wiped out the other stars, and the interpretation of it when he talked to his wise men was that there was a baby that was just been born or that was going to be born or that had been born over the last couple of years, baby boy, that was going to rise up and was going to kill him and conquer the kingdom. And so you might recognize this story. He calls the captain of his host, the captain of the armies or whatever, and says, go out and kill every baby 2 years old and less that's a male. Bring them all in. Say we're having this huge celebration, and then kill them all. But if they're girls, then give them all kinds of, give the parents all kinds of treats. So the captain of the king's host is called Terah. And so Terah goes out and does as instructed. The one baby that he does not kill is his own.
Makes sense.
Takes one of his servants' babies instead, buys the baby from him, and gives that and says that was his because Nimrod knew that Terah's wife was expecting. They lived in by the way, where the first ziggurat was in the New World, post-Diluvian. Of the Chaldees, the Chaldeans. I promise this all comes full circle. So there's a point to the story. Terah's baby boy is named Abram. Abram doesn't do anything, but Abram, later on, Abram is sent away, and he goes and lives with Noah and Shem for the first 10 years of his life and is taught in the ways of the old world and the creator God. That's where he got the education from Noah and from Shem, who was the holy one after the holy son of the three sons after the flood, according to all of these historical religious texts.
Wow. So
Noah teaches Abram for the first 10 years of his life, and then Nimrod forgets about it. When Abram at this point is 10 years old, he comes back, grows up, does what he does. They leave. Remember, after Abram was called, they leave of the Chaldees. Haran. So Terah goes with Abram, and they go to Haran. And then from there, Abram goes around. Later name is later changed to Abraham. I mean, the stories. He has the two sons, Isaac, Ishmael first, though. Promise this all comes full circle.
Right.
Ishmael first with Hagar. He's old. He's been promised a son, and Sarah says, "Oh, I can't conceive, so go knock up my handmaiden." And then Isaac, 12 or 13 years later, so he sends Hagar and Ishmael off. So, with that said,
and they become what then leads to the world of Islam, right? Just in case anyone's not familiar with how that all worked out.
Exactly. And in fact, in the Quran, it says that Ishmael and Abraham dedicated this first holy space and said, the effect is, and I don't remember the reference offhand, but I can get it for you if you're curious. To you, O God, do we dedicate this space? And it is the holy cube, that is Mecca. That holy cube, I can send this over because it's really fascinating. That holy cube is the three-dimensional black and white. It's the third piece of what Revelation, was it 3:9? The number of the beast is 6, 6, and 6.
Mhm.
So the cube on its side encompasses the two triangles. The quote Star of David, which is actually the Star of Rephaim and predates King David by over 1,000 years. It's the
Well, it's
Star of
like
Saturn.
the three-dimensional Saturn. That's what I was gonna say. Like the
It's the hex on Saturn.
hexagon in the middle of Saturn is becomes
Exactly.
a cube if you pull it out three-dimensionally.
Exactly. So when you think about that triangle, so the two triangles with the six-pointed quote Star of David, they actually touch when you bring them out. They touch that cube, which is the that same cube that's in Islam when it's turned 90 degrees on a point, and then inside of it you've got another square, which is also the hexagon, which comes out of Saturn, which we know that Saturn, for whatever inexplicable reason, actually has. And no surprise, but the symbol of Rephaim is a bull. What was it that the quote children of Israel sacrificed? Getting ahead of myself, the children of Israel sacrificed when they came out of Egypt, and Moses goes away for 40 days, and Aaron makes him a statue. It's a freaking baby bull.
Okay.
Yes, they've been on and on and on and on since the beginning of recorded time.
See, this is where, well, go ahead and finish because this is where I get questions. Is all this kind of stuff, including like the pole shift and like like Elon's been tweeting and talking about that a lot, like
Yep.
as if it's just no big deal. Yeah, there's a pole shift coming, but that's where like the idea of divine consciousness and then this whole materialism thing. That's where I start to have questions, but we'll go back to it.
Okay, so finishing up with this, so Nimrod has this dream. 150 years later, so 150 years later, it's Abram's grandson, one of his grandsons, Esau, that actually kills him.
Mm-hmm.
Esau becomes Edom. You fast forward a couple thousand years, Edom becomes Khazaria. And we can see that now with the genetic records, the DNA.
Wow.
So, and what is Khazaria? Well, that's
magic
really
money makers.
Yeah, exactly. But they didn't get the magic. They didn't create the magic money making. So the Talmudian magic, Babylonian Talmudic money magic, that actually comes from the Chaldeans. So bringing this whole thing full circle, I actually made a really cool map of this whole thing. So bringing this whole thing full circle. So Babylon 1, we've got Nimrod, his wife Semiramis, who's the goddess mother, and Marduk. Fast forwarding 1,000 years, so that's like 2200 BC. Then fast forwarding 1,000 years, we have Babylon 2, and we see, and which is powerful, I guess 1,500 years. So we can look and see that coming out of the quote children of Israel, after being in Egypt for Israel being Jacob's new name, being in Egypt for 480 years, and they go wander around for 40 years in the desert once they come out. And then, and incidentally, the Egyptians were blonde at that point as well. You look at the sarcophagus rubbings of like Nefertiti. She's got green eyes and blonde hair. And we can also see, not only from the rubbings, but we see from the mummies, King Tut's grandparents have blonde hair. It's really interesting. So we see this great replacement that happens during this time period as well, which is fascinating. So it's like, well, why can't these Egyptians today build the pyramids again? It's not the same Egyptians. And we see this time and time again. Same with the Persians. The Persians were actually Scythian during that time period. And again, we can see from their mummified remains that they were also blonde, big blonde beards. Really interesting. So
is that why Jesus always looks like a Northern European dude?
I mean, who knows? Because they've been replaced by that period. But we can see, so we know that this is really important. And I promise I'll tie this full circle and I'll be done with the whole religion thing. So in terms of this faith journey in my late 20s and early 30s, so seeing like, okay, so I knew that at that point that Christmas was kind of well, I like it, but I can see that the Christmas is actually a retelling of the story of Semiramis and Marduk dying, being reborn, all of the born of a virgin, all of these sorts of things. Because Nimrod had already died and Semiramis was somehow magically impregnant. So that was the Babylonian religion. And then, incidentally, on the 24th, 25th of December, and then Rome took that and said it was, I believe, Tiamat, which is, Mother Earth, the same sort of thing. They just renamed them, and that it was Mithras instead of Marduk. But same stories. They just reskinned it, and we can see this even with the in Rome with like the temples to Jupiter, which after the 3rd century, when Constantine says, "Hey, I need more soldiers. Let's magically have the Christians convert. We'll all just amalgamate our religions." Where Jupiter's basilica becomes just magically like, "Oh, St. Peter," because we blessed it. So the church fathers see all this stuff, and incidentally, and I actually was showing this in a couple of slides recently in these talks. There's a mitre that the Pope wears that's a 6-pointed star.
Mm-hmm.
Like the whole thing is there. It's the Star of Rethum. Like,
no.
Why is the Pope Jewish? Oh, because the Pope isn't Jewish. Because they're fake Jews. Because they're actually Khazarians. And that's the whole separating, the beware of those that say they're in Revelation, beware of those that say they're Jews but are not, the wheat from the tares, and all these sorts of things, right? All of this stuff has actually been in these holy books forever. And it ties back to Genesis 3:15, which says it's the creator that is ostensibly talking to Eve and the serpent at that point. There will be enmity between your seed and my seed, bruising the head, bruising the heel, those things. And enmity, if you look at it in the original Paleo Hebrew, it's only used twice in scripture, and it actually means a blood feud. Like there will be blood feuds forever, which makes so much more sense for the rest of the Old Testament. Like, why does the and all the nonsense we were told, like it was like trying to explain like some sort of an Earth-centric solar system instead of a heliocentric solar system with retrograde orbits, right? It was like people standing in their heads trying to explain why the heck the scriptures are somehow in the Old Testament about this angry God, and the New Testament is about this loving God. Well, when you look at it and say, no, it's because there's this blood feud in the Old Testament, and it's literally the Watchers that procreated and did all whatever they did. It's different DNA. They had 6 fingers, 6 toes. I mean, that's all recorded. They're a lot taller. That's why there's so much fascination with blood and all major world religions and power in the blood. I'm like, what the heck does that mean? Mm-hmm. Right? But when you tie it all together and say, well, it's all actually tied to DNA, and you think about like the snake on the pole with Moses, when you think about the snake on the tree, it's all coded. It's just allegory because it's all about DNA. It's a hint, hint, hint. Like it's all tied to our DNA, Rh negative, and all these sorts of things, right? But it's like when you tie it all the way back and say, okay, so the Old Testament's about this blood feud, and then when you look and say, okay, so the quote God's chosen people, they get carted off. The 10 northern tribes get carted off in 722 BC to Assyria, and Amos 5:25 through 27 decries at this point, is decrying and says, hey, because you worshipped Rephaim and the 6-pointed star, it actually calls it out. You've been taken off to Assyrian God. And then we see, and we know that in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar came and raided the southern 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin? I can't remember. Anyway, Judah and something, the southern 2 tribes, and takes them off to Babylon for 70 years. And so they come back around 5. And then, of course, Nebuchadnezzar's son, Balthasar, gets conquered by, Darius the Persian. And then Cyrus, after that, releases people to come back. And so some, quote, Jews, but they weren't actually called Jews, come back. When they went to Babylon in 586 BC, they believed that the Torah was their holy book, and they had priests, which were called Levites. When they came back, they no longer had priests. They believed the Talmud was their holy book, and they had rabbis. It's a different freaking religion. It got hijacked in that 70-year period. And so they come back, and you see this in the beginning of the New Testament. So whatever comes back, and then there's this, interestingly enough, there's this 500-year dark period. Well, there's a reason for that. After Malachi, before the New Testament, right? And so you look at all of this and say, all right, so what? And then you see in John 1, where Jesus the Christ is saying to Nathaniel, hey, there's an Israelite, not a freaking Jew because they weren't Jews, an Israelite in whom there is no guile. Interestingly enough, okay. And then later, he's decrying the Pharisees, interestingly enough, who were practicing or practitioners of Talmud, totally different. The Pharisees and the Sadducees. This is why Jesus kicked them, or the Christ, Yeshua kicked them out of the temple. Remember,
That's
they
my
were money
favorite Jesus
changers.
story, by the way.
Exactly.
I always talk
Because
about
why? Why? Because they were practitioners of Babylonian money magic in the temple. That's why. And so that's why he kicked them out. I mean, it's
that. Right.
all there in like plain view for anyone that wants to actually look at it. It's just people don't think. So again, looking back at this, and then Jesus is calling them a brood of, they're calling the Pharisees a brood of viper, your father is Satan, all of these different things. So it's pretty harsh, and we're taught in the fundamentalist church it's all allegory. So walking away from that, coming full circle to your question, and then saying like, all right, so what does that all mean? And then in my early 20s my late 20s and early 30s, looking at this and saying, oh, and all of this stuff didn't actually happen the way that apparently the way that we were taught in terms of World War II and what happened afterwards. Reading a lot of historical literature at that point led me to realize, holy cow. And on top of that, I'd also, I mean, this is just about eternity in their hearts, but my undergrad senior thesis, because one of my undergrad majors was Russian history. I don't know why. It just was.
Wow.
I mean, at that point, it wasn't like I knew all of this stuff. So I did my undergrad, like senior paper, and I was like, what? It wasn't long. It was like 25 or 30 pages on the Bolshevik Revolution and on Tolstoy and Lenin and Trotsky. So I was tracing it back at that point and realized where the money came from. And I was like, wait a minute, how did this money from these Bolsheviks all come from New York? And that's what led to, the stories we've talked about ever at that time. I was in my early 30s, looking and saying, oh, so the money all came from the New York banks, and then tying back that, and then of course, then reading Jekyll, Preacher from Jekyll Island, and going, okay, it makes all the sense in the world. So 1913, they get the newest Fed, and then they start World War I, because they have the ability to do so because they're printing money for these 13 families based out of nothing. And then in 1917, they fund the Russian Revolution. Why? And this ties full circle to the Putin interview with Tucker, where he name checks, and I promise this comes full circle to what I was talking about a minute ago. So he doesn't name check, excuse me, he date checks. So Putin date checks 862 AD. And I heard that on the interview, and I was like jumping up and down, like, holy crap, he knows, he's telling him. What did Putin say? Are we going to have a serious conversation? And what he was doing, he was calling out the Khazarians at that point. Why? Because who conquered the Khazarians beginning in 862 AD?
Must have been the Russians.
Yeah, he was the father of Rus, King Rurik. King Rurik was one of the 10 northern tribes that were scattered in the 7th century BC, came around, and they became the Vikings, the Danes, the Celts, the Goths. And they later came over, and these Khazarians, and interestingly enough, it's been whitewashed from history. But if you look at the Roman Empire, it never conquered what was Khazaria. And it was an enormous part. I mean, it was like the whole northern part of Europe, like central and northern Europe. Rome never conquered it. And so it butted up to that. And so this Khazarian empire lasted for hundreds of years. And so they were, they sacrificed to Molech, or whoever you want to call it, Molech, Baphomet, Saturn, Lucifer, Satan, whatever name that you want to call it, Baal. And so anyway, and they were kidnapping the Russian, well, what became the women that were Slavs from Rus, which were there to the east. Interestingly enough, today, no surprise, but today, Khazaria, the heart of Khazaria, is incidentally in what is Ukraine, especially Western Ukraine. So there's been this ongoing blood feud between Western Ukraine, especially not Eastern. Eastern is actually part of Rus historically. When they look at the historical capital in Odessa and even Kiev, but west over like we live, that was all part of the original historical territory all the way down to the Black Sea, or almost to the Black Sea, of the Khazarians. And so Putin knows this. He knows that. And so when he's calling people Nazis, getting ahead of myself, but the whole idea of calling people Nazis, it's a slur that comes from Ashkenazi.
Right.
It never had anything to do with the National Socialists. And I'm again getting ahead of myself. And you look at
Well,
the etymology.
just like the symbol that the Nazis used, like you
Exactly.
can't use it anymore. And it was like it's an ancient Buddhist symbol. It's an ancient Native American symbol. It's an ancient astrological symbol.
Yep. That's exactly right. So, and again, you look at the first stories that, or the first books that came out of post World War II, and you can see that there. I mean, the whole idea of the 6 million was just goofy, and it doesn't mean that nobody died in the concentration camps. I'm not saying that people definitely died. It wasn't 6 million. That whole 6 million idea, you can see from the 19 teens was there's 6 million people, or 6 million quote
Right.
Jews are going to die in Russia. In Russia, if the Bolshevik Revolution didn't happen. And they were saying that as far back as the 1880s. So anyway, getting ahead of ourselves. But looking and saying,
We're
okay,
definitely going to
so
get censored now.
well, cut that part out then.
No, it's crazy how
Anyway,
much they censor like just actual newspaper clippings on TikTok. It's like, oh, I found this newspaper clipping from, you know, like 5 years before World War II or from 1919 or whatever that like says 6 million, and like TikTok immediately bans their account. It's crazy. Anyway,
it's nuts.
continue.
Anyway,
So bring that into where how you see the world and spirituality or the sim or whatever your framework is today.
yeah, so coming full circle with all of this and how this ties together into spirituality today, I absolutely believe that there is a spiritual war. This is assuredly a sim. It's got 11 dimensions. It's the only way string theory works. Time is a dimension. It's only linear here, but we've got to be able to traverse time where it's the same as it's akin, not the same, but akin to space outside of this game. We have eternal souls that come in, get to experience pain and evil and terrible things happening in a way that we don't in a real world, a base level world. Let's just say where essentially all is love, and so we get to. I think we get to actually choose. I believe that we get to actually choose a lot of what we're going to come experience, what we get to come work through, maybe some of the people that we get to come work through it with. And that's why
And
we have these
what's the
hints
end goal of choosing
to,
to come here and deal with this?
to become better, to learn lessons, to improve ourselves as spiritual beings, eternal
Okay.
spiritual beings.
Okay.
So bringing that full circle to today, I believe that there are what I refer to as Khazarians, but again, they come from all the major world religions have been corrupted. So we see that the so Islam, which comes out of which comes out of Ishmael, has this idea of this cube, the six-pointed whatever this thing was. We see that clearly what was Torah was taken to Babylon in 586 BC, comes back in 516, and it's no longer Torah, but now it's Talmud. We no longer have priests, we have rabbis, and it's been absolutely corrupted. And then from there, we have Catholicism starting in 313 AD that is essentially an amalgamation of the Mithraic traditions and some of early church traditions. They gutted it, took the early scripture from 81 books to 66. So again, they love their sixes, and cut a lot of the real story behind the story out, which is why books like Jasher and Enoch are removed because they were too telling. And then we see that Protestantism comes out of Catholicism in Luther and his 95 Thesis, All Saints' Day, 1517. So again, that's still, we're reskinning the same hide, so to speak, right? Where it's like Christianity coming out of Catholicism, coming out of the Mithraic tradition, coming out of Babylonian Talmudism. And so looking and saying, so what is really true? And then, so again, we've got those major world religions that are all got their focus on the sixes. And again, we can see from DNA research now that over 97% of those currently living in Israel don't have any Semitic blood whatsoever. Just and this is, Johns Hopkins Med. And so we look at that and say, okay, so what does this all mean? And without getting too deep into the weeds, what does this all mean? Well, we've got a spiritual battle going on, and these Khazarians have, well, what used to be Khazarians, and then Ashkenaz, now Zionists, and all whatever names you want to call them. They control, at least in the West, both sides of the coin, and they control almost all of the 6 major money makers: banking, big ag, big pharma, media and entertainment. What am I missing? Anyway, they control government.
Education.
And what's the 6th one? I'm forgetting what the 6th one is. Education. Thank you. Yes. So they control all. So you look back and you can say, okay, so over the last 100 or so years, well, we can see that, the Rockefellers in the 1930s with education rolling out the first wave of feminism. Why? It wasn't because they believed in anything feminist. It was because they wanted to roll out the Marxist agenda to the masses through education. And so all you have to do is control first higher education, get some teachers in, and then you control the kids. They're not homeschooled anymore. And you double up the fiat paying, tax paying earners.
Right.
Which just, I mean, so it's like you just doubled your workforce, and then you can cut everyone's pay down by inflating this quote currency away, this fiat away, which you control anyway, and it's based on nothing.
Well, exactly. So what's the ultimate goal of that? Like this, like you say, it's a spiritual battle, and this has been going on in our material world for millennia.
Yep.
So what's the ultimate goal of having so much money, or is it not about the money, it's about the power? And then you have to take that to, okay, well, who's behind the power ultimately and why? And then my question is, so then how are we to live within that? Are we supposed to just deal with it? Like, would it have been better if Kamala Harris won, for example, because it would force us to face more quickly and more directly the real spiritual enemy? Whereas right now, a lot of the awakening that's taken place the last few years maybe is going to fade out for millions of people because they just are going to be like, oh, cool. All right, everything's back to normal. We can just trust in Trump and Elon, and let's just go back to living our normal life. Whereas there has been a spiritual awakening of sorts over the last 4 years since lockdown started.
Yep. So in terms of, one more thing. So that scripture in Amos 5:25 and 27 is referenced by Stephen in Acts 7. He's the first martyr. And the reason that the Pharisees martyr him is because he references in Acts 7:45 through 47, Amos 5:25, but he spins it. And so instead of saying that their fathers were hauled off to Assyria, he says they were hauled off to Babylon because they know the story. But he references it and saying basically, hey, your fathers also, like you guys, also worship Saturn, Lucifer, whatever, and you also are praying to the same star and have the same religion. That's why they stoned him. So it's fascinating. So it's in both Old Testament and New Testament. Again, so it all ties together full circle. What does it mean? It means that we have a spiritual war that's going on. I think that the Georgia Guidestones were absolutely accurate in the sense of, that's part of this Khazarian, part of their karma is they have to say, and this is why they use NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, they have to say what it is they're going to do. This is why Hollywood, look at the etymology of Hollywood. What does the holly berry do, right? I mean, the holy tree, I mean, they used to, a couple thousand years ago, right? It causes hallucinations. Why would they name that Hollywood otherwise? I mean, Walt Disney's 33rd degree Mason. I mean, all this stuff, right? And so anyway, without going down the Disney side, either Florida or California, but just looking at all of that, where Hollywood comes from. So they control all of this, this small group. And they've been telling us since at least Alice in Wonderland that, I mean, again, Alice in Wonderland being this great children's, bringing this full circle at the very beginning of the conversation, where in the 1850s, Benjamin Disraeli, he's portrayed by Tennille as the Mad Hatter. He's the prime minister, by the way, at that point, right? And he shows up in this children's book. It's the same cartoon. Why? Why is he the Mad Hatter? And what is the importance of that? Well, he's Khazarian, and he says in not one but two books, everything is blood. Nothing else matters. And I can get you the exact quote from the pages. So what does that mean? Well, we know that Jews are not blood, they're a religion. But inside of that, you've got masquerading these Jews that aren't Jews, so to speak, these Judeans. And incidentally, they weren't actually called Jews until the 17th century AD. They were called Judeans. Not that it matters. But still, so we look at this and say, all right, words are things, numbers are things, we know this. And so what does that mean for today? Well, it means we've got a spiritual war going on where the vast
Between
majority
who?
what's that?
Between who?
Between the Khazarians that are trying to take over the world so they can have total global domination and
Okay.
everybody else that they don't like that doesn't even know there's a war going on.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's
So
not like there's
we'll get to motive. Keep going. We'll get back
okay,
to motive.
okay. So ultimately, I mean, this whole thing is about power. That's why there's been ongoing constant wars for the last 100 years, because what better way
Or
to
10,000.
sure, but for the last 100 years, since we've had all this fake money, well, this fiat that we can print truly ex nihilo, what better way to launder it than to sell? I mean, what better laundering mechanism than to make a $140 toilet and sell it for $40,000 to the Pentagon? Then the entirety of that is profit to your multinational corporation that's an arms dealer. And then you keep blowing up. What possible better way can you make money than to blow up your end product over and over and over again, and then make money on both sides of it? So it's like it's the most lucrative game. And on top of that, of course, you're murdering people, and so you've got all the energy harvesting from that. But ultimately, I mean, it comes back, I think, full circle to books like Brave New World, Animal Farm, etc., where it's like, the idea of totalitarianism forever. I think that's part of it, truly, because then it brings in this total evil control that we're really seeing, especially in Fourth Turnings out in the open.
So
Additionally,
oh, go ahead. I was going to say, if you step back though from that and you look at, so fourth turnings over the last 1500 years, right? That's what they addressed was, I think it was around 1500 years, every 80 to 100 years, there's this massive war. But then you go back even further, like you're talking about, you go back for several thousand years, and it's this repetitive sort of thing that keeps happening. So if this is some type of spiritual simulation that we have a material world that, however it becomes material because of our consciousness or because it's created as a simulation, etc., that we have to come and, like you said, learn lessons. Wouldn't it make sense that there would just be constant strife and warring? Like that there's never going to be actually world peace, because if the lesson is on a different plane or on a different brain, right? That where our ultimate reality is, and the goal is to get out of this matrix as a more enlightened spiritual being, like there's never going to be peace on earth. Or is there? See, because my premise of this whole thing is maybe flawed, but I think it's fascinating because we do live in this world, and so it's worth investigating, which is if people were more consistent with at least with what they say they believe. I'm not saying one religion is more true than another. Maybe they're all false, or maybe they're all true, saying things in a different way in different languages, talking about the same universal divine consciousness God. But if people just lived what they said the tenets of their religion were, the world probably would be a more peaceful place, because you would have to abide by the framework of your belief system, which is for most religions somehow based in love, somehow based in kindness, treating other people the way you want to be treated, fairness, not murdering, etc. So is there a solution? Like these groups maybe are in control, but what is their ultimate end game? Or has it been designed by, like David Icke talks about, like this isn't even the matrix, this is a matrix created by other beings, and somehow we got trapped in here. Which I'm not sure that I completely buy that argument, but I mean, there's a lot of really interesting viewpoints on what Earth actually is. So, like how this is coming back to where your belief system is today, and in terms of being a spiritual being, having a human experience, knowing all of the history of this planet, this sim, how do you determine the best way, the most ethical way? How do you determine ethics in the first place? And then how do you determine how you should live within this? Is the goal to
I
take
mean,
those people out, or not those people, but to take that machine out? That is that part of the spiritual battle? Are we supposed to join that? And if so, how?
yeah, those are obviously huge questions. I mean, taking one at a time, we can see that, you know, taking a lot of different sorts, I mean, a number of different sorts of medicine, plant medicine, we can see that there's so much that is interconnected at a very base level. And we can see that there are, I mean, so many people have incredibly similar experiences
Mhm.
with things like psilocybin or rapa or 5-MeO DMT or DMT or ayahuasca or mescaline or peyote, all of these sorts of plant medicines that, for whatever reason, are banned or restricted, even though they're not addictive. And some of them are neuromodulators. And so looking and saying, what does that what does that mean for us? Like peering behind the curtain, at least for short periods of time, understanding that the world is so interconnected and that it is a sim. And are we trapped in a sim within a sim? I mean, that's an interesting theory that Ike has. I don't know, but what's the point? I think ultimately for me, and this is something I've wrestled with over the last few years, and and especially I think since 2020, especially. Well, no, I don't think I know since 2020. And getting to spend a chunk of time, at the ranch, just kind of, especially that summer and fall, by myself, and looking and just saying like, so why am I here and what's the purpose and why was I blessed with these gifts and what do I get to do with them and how do I use them?
Right.
And is it most beneficial for the most people if I engage in this battle, so to speak? And at that point, 2020 was the COVID battle, or
Mhm.
if I just sort of opt out and say, I'm going to ignore this. Not ignore it like stick my head in the sand, just ignore it, like laugh at it and go, this is stupid. I call your charade out, and I'm not gonna give you any power by abdicating mine. I'm gonna
Or
live
by
my life.
engaging with it, right?
Exactly.
No.
Exactly. I'm gonna live my life, and I'm just going to smile and ignore you. And by so doing, it's like you really disarm the idiots that thought that, I don't know, and believe the nonsense. And so in terms of, do we engage with the in this battle? I think there was a lot of different ways to engage in it. For me now, I suppose my way of engaging in the battle is by speaking truth.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't want to feed evil. So going out and being violent, I'm not saying there's not a time for violence. However, it's certainly, I mean, I want to be prepared in all ways. I want to be anti-fragile. I want to have optionality. These are things that, we just talk about on an ongoing basis. But ultimately, it's the whole idea of the white dog and the black dog, or the wolves, right? Which one wins? The one you feed the most. And I want to focus on good, and I want to focus on on love and on light, not on going out and being as destructive as I can be to win a battle, because I think I'm actually feeding the wrong side. So in
Okay,
the grand
so
scheme,
go ahead.
no, I was going to say, in the grand scheme of things, what does that mean in terms of my purpose here? I mean, I think that I think that there are many levels to the sim. I think it's an adventure that our eternal souls get to come into this temporal adventure, experience evil. I think there are eternal consequences, but I think it's what we make it, in terms of like, let's go out and do crazy things, and let's teach experiences that we've learned, and let's love, and you know, let's be adventurous, and let's procreate, and do all these really cool things that we get to do in this spiritual Disneyland, so to speak.
And so how do you then connect those two very disparate sort of existences? One under this long running sort of cartel that may or may not be like completely spiritually driven and controlled. That essentially this planet has been controlled by those forces, those entities, that group for thousands of years in some shape or fashion. And so everything that it seems like their motivation is to do is to keep you from exactly what you just said. Living with love, living with peace, having harmony, having adventure, having joy, all of those higher frequencies. The whole system is designed to rob you of those from birth, essentially, especially now in our more modern world. And so, I mean, knowing the the more broad framework as you do, how does that affect your daily life in the way that you're like, okay, well, I'm gonna enjoy life anyway. I'm gonna because I don't think that violence is necessarily the solution at all. I think if this is a simulation where we're supposed to be learning, then the harder things get, the more that we're supposed to be like, okay, what is my purpose through this? How do I get through this? And maybe at some point, then, violence is called for. But I think in our modern world, like, what are we really going to do in terms of violence? Whereas, what can we do if, as a people, like we've seen that the last few years, I think, a movement of people really waking up and starting to speak up against these things and to, in their own way, attempt to raise the collective frequency. Sounds really cliche, but like that's really what has happened. And that's why, at least for right now, like Elon Musk has done a very good thing because the only place where the whole world could collectively get together and have those positive conversations and actually talk about things truthfully, the good, the bad, and the ugly, has been on X. Because the other platforms, like Rumble or BitChute or like these other ones are just too small. There's not enough of a collective, presence there to do that.
Critical
So
mass.
yeah. And so, I mean, it does religion, I guess, to get to the point of religion in this, um, does religion have a place in our society, or do people need to wake up to kind of the place where you are, which is more of, well, I guess we gotta go back to that. You gotta finish defining that. We got off on tangents there, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like, should people try and get better with their religion, or should we just can the whole thing, the whole experiment, and be like, look, this is all crazy and made up. Look at the history of it. It's like every one of these things come from deception that 3,000, 5,000 years ago, or after the last pole shift, or whatever.
Right. Well, again, I mean, first of all, defining our terms. I would start with saying, how do we define religion? I would define religion as something that I do over and over by rote. So for me, being
Ritual.
religious would be, flossing and brushing my teeth every morning and night, putting on my deodorant, getting up at 4:32 every morning. Those are things that are kind of religious.
Okay.
Spirituality is a relationship with my creator. That has more to do with like meditating and focusing on being really intentional, and speaking life, like really visualizing with intent when I'm focusing and I'm meditating and I'm praying, especially in the morning, whether I'm in the sauna or before when I'm on the way to the gym or whatever it is I'm doing. So those are things that I think, and also then what is it that we are doing, the royal we that I'm doing with the gifts that I've been blessed with. Again, the whole idea of being born on third base and not thinking I hit a triple, so to speak.
Mhm.
It's like when you're just blessed inherently with the ability to do a lot of things really well, that means you have a ton more obligation. And I would tie that back to the parable of the talents, which in the Bible's New Testament, and they're not talents like we think about talents, they're a measure of weight.
Right.
And and ultimately the moral of the story that Yeshua or Jesus is attributed to saying is like, to whom much is given, much is expected. And so with that said, I would look at my own spirituality as like, how do I work through a lot of the crap that, from childhood and probably stuff honestly that my eternal soul brought into the sim in some form or fashion. How do I
Yeah.
get better at this? Going back to, I don't know, people that I think, I swear, we've talked about this in the past, are time travelers, but the brothers or sisters or whatever the heck they were, I think they're trolling us with the whole sisters thing, but with Cloud Atlas and Matrix, or the Matrix, especially the first one, no, that's a freaking documentary. No, it's a historical record. That's not a science fiction. And same with Cloud Atlas, right? So looking at those sort of ideas and saying, I believe these to be true and fairly accurate. Maybe not the actual like Neo and I mean, I'm not talking about Morpheus. I'm not talking about the actual characters, but I'm talking
Right.
about ideas,
Right,
right?
right.
The archetypes.
No, Cloud Atlas is yeah. That was actually the movie that right after that when I was at the bottom of the pool and I was like, oh, Grandma was right. Like
Yep.
the next flight I got on, like that was the movie I watched, and I was just like, whoa.
Yep.
But I mean, it makes a lot of rational sense with my worldview. But
Mine too. So tying that full circle in terms of spirituality, I believe that there is, and maybe this will put a little bit of a bow on all those sort of tangents, all those arrows we shot out and bring them all full circle into one target. I believe that there is a monotheistic creator that created both good and evil. I believe that this is a sim where there have been beings, watchers, whatever you want to call them, Elohim, that fell and procreated, and that is recorded in the historical record and in the spiritual text or the religious text, excuse me, and that whether it was a pole shift or whatever caused the flood, I mean, we now know there's more water. The whole idea in Genesis of the what the fountains of the deep opening up, which always seemed like nonsense until recently, and now just within the last couple of years, we found out there's more water under the Earth's like several hundred miles down than there is at the surface. So that would have come up, and I have a friend who's a retired college professor who swears he's found in somewhere in Turkey, swears he's found Noah's Ark, and that the Turkish authorities know it's there, and they're keeping a real close eye on it. They've got drones around it at all times because it would cause such an uproar. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But ultimately, looking and saying spiritually, and this goes back to an idea that my buddy David Howett wrote in one of his book. Like, why is this happening for me? And so looking and questioning the things that we encounter on a regular basis and saying, why is this happening for me? I think is really useful in terms of our spirituality. What do we get to learn from this? How do we get to improve? How do we get to be better? So that, I mean, the whole idea of, in this sense, I think there's some true nuggets of truth to this, some actual nuggets of truth to this, in the sense of maybe not necessarily with karmic points, but something akin to that. How do we get better as eternal souls? I'm not saying we come back as a toad or as an ant, but how do we get better as eternal souls? I think that's part of why we're here, assuredly.
do you think there's evil in the next level?
Yeah, different forms. I don't think this is the only place where there's evil. I, imagining it, I mean, what is the next? Is it a next level, or are there just other levels? I think there's a ton of these video games per se that are like this sim. Because if our souls are eternal, what are we doing? We're not just sitting around, with a harp and a cloud. We're out doing things. So it's like if you think about eternity, as hard as that is to think about in from a temporal perspective, but if you think about eternity, it's like, why wouldn't you want to go to Disneyland? Which is why with the whole idea of television and video games has always killed me. Like, why would I want to? I'm in a freaking sim, man. I don't need to go watch your sim bull crap or play a video game. Like, go outside, have some
Right.
fun. You're in a sim already.
It's like the metaverse. Then it becomes like Inception, where you just go down more and more layers, and then you're playing a
Exactly.
video game in the video game with your virtual reality goggles on
Amazing
within this
movie,
sim.
and that ties into Ike's idea, right? Where we're in a matrix within a matrix. That really is the whole idea of Inception. And so that's why time seems like it's so long, is because, you're again trapped within maybe two levels up. It's just a couple of minutes, but you get stuck in this video game, and you get stuck in this video game, so to speak. I mean, that's the easiest way for us to translate it now. Heck, Plato's idea of the cave 2,500 years ago works just as well. The shadows in the cave versus the real thing.
What do you think about the idea of the simulation, or not the simulation, but the simulation being created by divine consciousness for the purpose of evolving itself, to where we are essentially all connected and all part of that one consciousness, which is why mass psychosis is possible, which is why mass awakenings are possible, which is why the collective mind, the hive mind, is possible. But to where it's like an eternal evolutionary process that we are part of, and our individual, the whole reason why, at the core, why living our purpose is so important beyond, okay, we need to learn lessons to become more enlightened, to become more like God, to be more purified, but also the lessons that we are here to learn, like our only purpose. It's like a white blood cell versus a red blood cell. Like our only purpose is whatever we are put here to do in order to help the collective God consciousness evolve itself.
Words of things. So the collective conscious, I would differentiate from the God conscious.
Okay.
So the collective conscience, if we're here, sure, we see mass psychosis, we see that many people have the same sixth sense, so to speak. We see that we're able to awaken, the decalcifying of the third eye, all these sorts of things, telekinesis, telepathy, this ongoing awakening that seems as though it's transpiring right now, and it's probably happened many times in the past. Is that happening collectively? Yes, or seems like it. However, by definition, how can God evolve? That is, my definition of God is the ability to create tabula rasa and ex nihilo. Additionally, my definition of God is a being that is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. So with those things in mind, how does that evolve? Especially if that
how
God
does it not? I guess so the logical question would be, why would it not evolve? Because
what does evolution look like then?
well, that's the whole form of our enlightenment, right? Of our growing as spiritual beings. So if it's, I mean, you can sort of separate, if we are spiritual beings having a human experience in order to become more enlightened as spiritual beings, then on a different level, the things that we do here are impacting the growth and the enlightenment of that being. So in the same way, if you zoom it all the way out to where this God consciousness is constantly creating, and it takes a different view of good and evil, because it just is. So that's why, you look at scriptures, or you look at Christianese cliches of like, well, God's going to work everything out to good. Well, yeah, because it's just constantly evolving forward. Because I guess the question logically that I would have is, if God stops creating, then what is the purpose of anything? Then you go back almost to nihilism, where it's like, well, there's no purpose of anything. There's not even a purpose of God's existence, because he's not using his ability to create.
Right.
If he's omnipotent and he can just continue creating for eternity, and as a creator, I think every creator can relate to that. It's like you never fear that you're going to run out of something to create, or as a builder, you never fear that you're going to run out of something to build.
Right.
It's like you don't necessarily think about what you're going to do 20 years from now. You're focused on what you're doing right now, but you know that after this one, something else is going to come up. There's going to be some other inspiration. So why wouldn't God be a sort of similar, and maybe I'm putting too much of, human aspects onto God, but if we're made in God's image, which most religions allude to in some form, and really one of the highest ways of expression and growth and learning and understanding and communication is through creativity and the construction of something new from nothing, from an idea. Why wouldn't God be continually coming up with new ideas?
Presumably that's rhetorical because it seems highly logical. I agree. It seems highly logical that God is creating on an ongoing basis. And so you're right. What does that look like?
Because otherwise, then you think about like the endless loop of coming back and learning lessons of reincarnation, and from a Buddhist perspective or something. And it's like, well, at the end,
Mm-hmm.
once you become an enlightened being, you're still sitting on a cloud. It just doesn't look the same as like sitting on a cloud with a harp, like the Christian heaven version of for Sunday school. But it's like, well, then your third eye is glowing and like you're just floating in the multiverse. It's the same thing. Like that eventually,
Yep.
what's the motive then to enlighten, to become an enlightened being if in the end you're just gonna stop? Like the weird thing is sometimes now like I have these moments and it's happened a lot more. Like the more I've done plant medicine, the more that you go off planet basically. Like you go outside of this level and you're
Yep.
the more you're able to bring back. So it's like when you
Yep.
start working on writing down your dreams, the more that you are able to remember your dreams.
Yep.
It's the same sort of thing on a spiritual level. And so sometimes just like sitting here talking or just driving or whatever, I'll just have a moment of just like that connection with like, whoa, like this is like eventually I'm gonna die. And when you really think about that, it's like, oh, but like I kind of know like then like a tiny little part of it, but then it's like then you don't know what happens after that tiny little part of it, which is where David Icke's whole thing of like and many other people there's like don't go to the light, it's a trap, and these other ideas of what happens after death and with new near death experiences, etc. But
Right.
ultimately, I like the idea of God constantly creating and recreating himself, itself,
Mm-hmm.
consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
and that we have a role to play in that. Because then, like, we don't understand eternity, and maybe eternity is nothing that we can even comprehend because of our finite, connection to the framework of time. But within my little human brain, when I think about eternity, and I think about sitting on a cloud, or I think about burning in a lake of sulfur, or I think about becoming an enlightened being floating through the space in a very ethereal way. Like none of that really sounds as appealing as what if we all just like can choose to be part of God continually creating and it has no beginning and it has no end and we just the reason that we're here at this on this point is simply to figure out what our purpose is and to do that. And when you do that, you make an impact that then helps I think it helps both. I understand what you're saying to differentiate between God consciousness and collective consciousness, like
Mm-hmm.
the idea of the superorganism, like Bloom talks about it in the Lucifer principle,
Yep.
where it's just like we're all just a big school of fish, and there is a difference between that. But I think ultimately if God is omnipresent, then God being love, God being the God molecule, is within every living thing and every non-living thing that is made up of
Yep.
the same atoms.
Yep.
So then it really is the whole system evolving itself and in some way that I don't think we're ever really going to be able to understand, but if we can understand the parts that we can grasp as humans from whatever perspective, whether someone grows up in Asia or Saudi Arabia or East Tennessee, like to put God in the center of that and say, okay, this is my framework, and I'm going to be the absolute best Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, Scientologist, whatever that I can possibly be. I think that would actually make a positive difference. But maybe I'm wrong because
Yeah.
maybe like the whole, like you're saying, the history of the world is so convoluted and violent and controlled by forces that seem to not want us to do that.
I mean, I don't think it's as controlled as we think it is, though. I think that it's they use force multipliers. that these forces of evil use force multipliers to make it seem like they are legion, so to speak.
Hmm.
And then from time to time, the I don't know, the good souls, let's just say, kind of decide to wake up and coalesce and because ultimately it seems like most good people just want to be left alone. And it's those on the
Or to do
fringes
good. Yeah.
or do good, exactly.
Yeah, I
But
got
it's those on the fringes, it's the 2.5% on the fringes that really have an outlandish, um, but also overweight, um, outsized, maybe is a better way of putting it, an outsized um, voice and pulpit, especially in fourth turnings. And kind of you look at that, and Rand talks about that, right? With in Atlas, Shrugged, with the whole idea of I mean the appropriately named, what is it, Mooch, right? Who's like
Butchers.
the giver, exactly. He's the giver of favors, and we see that happening over the last, call it, decade in Washington D.C. And consequently, we see the not only the GDP in terms of median and mean wage in and around Washington D.C. and also the housing prices and the highest net, or the highest in terms of net worth, the highest um, earnings in terms of zip codes, all of those things. I mean, that's just grown enormously in and around Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, and Maryland. Why? Well, because of all the lobbyists and the defense contractors and this entire ecosystem that's grown up over the last decade or two as we've entered this fourth turning. And so, if that happens, and you think about when Rand wrote that, and retrospectively what she was looking at, and that would have been during the last fourth turning. So it's like, back to your point, does this just happen over and over with each seculum, each long lifetime? And are we in it again? And does that mean that we're going to get another killer first turning coming up? I mean, by good, in terms of killer, first turning coming up soon. And what do we get to do with that spiritually?
Well, that's where, I mean, you mentioned Cloud Atlas. That's sort of the idea of that, right? By every crime
Mhm.
and every kindness, we build our future.
Yep.
And you see the people's journeys through time from way
Mhm.
back in the past into way into the future. And yet, yeah, the world continues to go through these cycles while the people either evolve or devolve.
Mhm.
I mean, it is a choice, and it's not that everybody just gets to keep coming. I mean, who knows? But it seems like you could make choices, and that's been part of the whole thing with the transhumanism and with the jabs and all of that is like the goal to truly remove the soul,
Mhm.
which then is, I mean, because that's not something that we have seen historically, right? There's no historical records that we have, at least, of this type of material anti-spirit technology in use.
Mhm.
And maybe it's been wiped from the records. Maybe it was in Atlantis or in the library in Alexandria or wherever.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it seems like with what we know, because there's so many rabbit holes you can go down, but eventually it's like, well, I still have to live, I still have to eat, I still have, you know, this material life wherever I am, whether it's somebody selling bananas in Guatemala or, somebody in India that's snake charming, or I'm just thinking like, whether it's a really poor person or it's someone that's, at the top of a penthouse in New York City,
Mhm.
everybody still has this life and this journey to do something. So what guides that? Like from your perspective, and we can tie it together with that, like with where you are now and this journey, because it seems like it's been, most of your adult life then from having those realizations in college and the sort of intellectual awakening as well as the spiritual seeking. I remember that was like
Mhm.
your handle with the early days of the
Yep.
internet. It was like Seeker or something or other.
Seeker. Yep. The
Um,
90s. As a
yeah,
kid. Mhm.
but like where how would you recommend that people figure out their philosophical framework in order to, whether it's find their purpose or to just have a higher frequency life, like a happier, more joyful, loving life? Like there has to be something tangible. It can't just exist in the ethereal, you know, theological. We have to bring it back to, and this is sort of the, have I told you the story of where this even came from?
Uh-uh.
Ah, okay. I think I'm gonna do like a one person podcast for the first one to introduce it. I gotta like really tell it good. But so I mean I've always thought about, we've talked about it, like joked about how, it's a good thing that certain religions are bad at their religion, otherwise they would just go around killing everybody or, doing
Right.
these horrible things because that's
Yep.
what's in their holy book.
Yep.
But so being in Mexico, like there's lots of baptisms, communions, confirmation, all of these things, right? And so
Hmm.
this year with Gabby, we've gotten to be padrinos for a few of those, and I've started to notice a pattern. But it really like sent me over the edge when I went to a baptism of a baby that I didn't really know the people. Like I'd met them like once or something. It was like one of our friends.
Oh.
So we go to the baptism. That's cool. They do the whole thing and you go to mass and it's beautiful and they pray for the babies and they bless them and all that. But then you have to go to a salon, you have to go to a party for like 4 or 5 hours. And so I'm sitting there and it's like you got Bad Bunny and like all of this
Ah.
reggaeton on the stereo. The people are drinking, all the adults are drinking alcohol and the kids are stuffing their faces with, processed sugar from the piñata. And I'm just like,
Hmm.
no one is talking about why we are here. Why are we here? Because you just dedicated your baby in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Like, this is something with eternal consequences according to your belief, and no one's even mentioning it. We're all just getting drunk and high on sugar and listening to Bad Bunny. Like, this is not okay. And I'm not okay with wasting another day of my life doing this,
Right.
right? And like,
Yep.
it really sent me over the edge because this is something that just have generally been interested in and like kind of had some curiosity and passion to continue learning like my whole life, as have you. But
Yep.
that just pushed me over and I'm just like, you know what? Someone has to talk about this. And I feel like I have enough understanding from having been in so many different religious cultures around the world,
Hmm.
the way that we grew
Hmm.
up, my own spiritual journey of coming out of a very fundamentalist Christianity and going all the way to like agnostic theism and then coming back to where it's like, no, you know what? There is definitely a benevolent creator of form of love that is like holding all of this together and
Yep.
really evolving my own viewpoint on that. But so because of that, I feel like I can have conversations with people of every religion and treat them with respect, but these are questions that we should be asking and talking about. Like as a species on this planet. Because if people actually looked at like, okay, this is what I say I believe, but yeah, I could do a better job of living it. Even if it's just like the basic of what you're saying, like live with love. Like, what are the Ten Commandments? Or skip the whole Ten Commandments because that's Old Testament. What did Jesus say? Like, love your neighbor as yourself, right? Like, love God, keep his
Yep.
commandments, and love your neighbor as yourself.
Yep.
Like, those are the two things. Okay, so we can narrow it from 10 to 2 now.
Yep.
By doing that? No, yeah, no, probably not. Like, am I putting God at the center of whatever my material occupation is? Or like, are we even putting God at the center of things that are about God, like baptizing our baby? Right? I mean, it's like, and
Right.
every religion has these things. I'm not just singling that out. That's just was the situation that like lit the fire under me because I mean, I've seen this in Islam. I've seen this, and with some things, maybe you can say thankfully that people are not so good at all of the aspects of their religion. But like, because I think if that's sort of a motivation and a goal is I want to be as in line with what I say I believe as I can,
Yeah.
then
So you don't have cognitive dissonance, right? I
exactly,
mean, that's
then
like
people are going to be willing to
that
look at
ties into the
somebody
whole
else.
idea of flow.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, no, but that's exactly it. Because then people are going to be willing to question a lot more. And so then if you have that across different viewpoints, different fundamental religious theologies, with everyone saying, okay, this is what my framework says, this is how I should live. Oh, this is what you say. Well, these are where we connect. Like, I'm not advocating for a one world religion. I'm not advocating for any type of centrally controlled, top-down controlled framework at all.
Right.
I'm saying from the bottom up, if we as people realize that, like, we're not as divided as they want us to think we are. And I
Right.
think this ties in with a lot of what you were saying, is that all of those sort of diabolical things that have happened over thousands of years have been to divide and conquer.
100%.
And
Yep.
so if we can, from the bottom up, start to come and have conversations of where we realize we have way more in common, where Christians and Muslims and Hindus and people who are new age, like,
Mm.
where we realize we have so much in common, actually, I think that that will actually potentially be healthy for the planet rather than detrimental in some way that, fundamentalists would attack me probably. And I hope that I'll be able to talk to really, really like Westboro Baptist type of pastors who are, off on the extreme end, because I mean, I can handle whatever they come at me with grace, but
Yep.
I'm also going to ask them, like, direct questions. That it just doesn't, there's a lot of those types of extreme aspects of religion that don't make sense. And even with Christianity, right? Like Assembly of God and Foursquare, these two
Right.
huge denominations of evangelical Pentecostal church, and they're
Yep.
split over a single interpretation of a single verse.
Yep.
That to me is insane. And hopefully I'm going to be able to like talk to an Assembly of God pastor and a Foursquare pastor at the same time and be like,
Yeah.
explain this, like
Yeah.
figure it out, because this is not what Christ would want to see, and it's not what the Creator envisions when even within your framework. I'll just talk within your framework. It's not of God. It's not biblical. There's just so many of those little divisions. So that's kind of the motive for this whole thing. And like I've had
Yeah.
some
Really
interesting
cool backstory.
conversations, and I hopefully like we'll be able to keep having more and more interesting conversations with people all over the world that have different viewpoints. I mean it's just something that's a passion, but I think that if it can contribute positivity to the conversation and
Yeah.
get people talking and questioning to in a way that brings us together,
Mhm.
then it has value.
It's something that is, it makes a ton of sense, obviously, knowing the backstory, tying in with the name. It makes a ton of sense just looking at, again, and this, what you're saying being sort of the corollary to what I was talking about, shooting all those arrows out and talking about the backstory and how many major world religions that claim billions of the B of humans as their followers
Mhm.
are all based, they're all predicated on this, they all come from the same dude. So they all come from Abraham. I mean, out of Abraham, out of Ishmael comes the six-pointed cube, which is Islam. Out of Isaac come Jacob and Esau. Out of Esau come the Khazarians. Out of Jacob come the 12 tribes of Israel, incidentally, with four different women. And then, from there comes the Pharisees, come again, Talmud. This all ties full circle. Comes Catholicism, comes Christianity, and then everything comes out of there. I mean, Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses, all of this is different things. And so it's like literally you're talking about, I mean, what, three-quarters of the world?
Mhm.
Aside from Asia, in terms of spirituality, when I'm not talking about Shinto and Taoism and Buddhism and Hinduism.
Well, but those all have very rich history going back thousands of years as well on
For
their own.
sure.
There's many different splits that it has made too.
Yeah, no, for sure. But just looking and saying, I mean, all of that comes out of Abraham. And so why are, I mean, you look at even just over the past 2,000 years and how there have been so many wars. I mean, almost all wars being religious wars in some form or fashion, especially when you roll in Babylonian
Yeah.
Talmudism. And and so why? I mean, truly, going back to, first year law school, cui bono, who benefits? And truly, who does benefit? It always comes back to the idea of the Babylonian money magic. And so from there, and I think tying into the whole idea of religion and spirituality, it's how do we understand that money is certainly not the root of all evil? Maybe the love of money, the lust of it might be, and yet it's money being so different from fiat. Money buying us the exchange of value, buying us freedom of our times to follow the passions spiritually and in every other way, and arguably the things that we love to do having a rich spiritual component, especially when you talk about flow state, right? Where it's like you think back to something that when we talked about as kids, where it's like before flow state had been studied truly. And I mean, I remember saying, like, where do I find peace in the middle of a class 5+ rapid where everything slows down, right? And it was like I remember being in the most chaotic times of my life, business wise, in my like late 20s. And well, let's say, hey, let's go riverboarding and run something super gnarly because I could be able to forget about it because I had to focus on, and life slowed down because, of course, time being, just a dimension, of course, it slows down. 3 minutes underwater feels like an eternity, and 3 minutes with someone you love feels like a split second. So it's like that whole idea of a flow state, taking you to into a spiritual dimension, I think is, maybe not a topic for this conversation, but again, bringing full circle to why would you want to be addicted to, especially the colors and like something like a screen, whether it be a television or a phone or a computer or whatever it is, a video game, where that keeps you addicted to something that is a sim within the sim, instead of going out and using the gifts and talents that we've been gifted with here to do something that has a true spiritual component. And I guess the gamer could argue, well, I was born to be an e-gamer, whatever, e-sport person, maybe.
Right.
But yeah, for me at least, I look at wanting the freedom of my time to be able to do the things that I truly love. Incidentally, one of the things I truly love is building businesses. So it's like I want freedom of my time to build and grow businesses because I love it, and it's a game. But that also has a spiritual.
How do you see that with a spiritual component? I mean, aside from the individuals that make up that, like, are you looking to build? I was actually talking to somebody about that, about, for example, the improvements in conservative entertainment, not Christian necessarily, but like more, well, just the antithesis of Hollywood. You look at what Mel Gibson has done
Mhm.
now, and what the Daily Wire is attempting to do,
Okay.
and it's not, the cheesy, ridiculous, horrible Christian entertainment from 2000. So,
Right.
but aside from that, like in terms of building business, is your goal then to make an impact? Would it be more like impact investing, or is it like, do you have an overarching goal like Elon Musk where you want to help humanity get off planet and to be able to go and travel through the stars and to multiply in that way? Or, I mean, what's the end goal? Or is it simply like, well, these are the talents that I have, and so I'm going to be as useful as I can and make as much as I can so that I can enjoy life as much as I can?
No, I think there's a spiritual component to the game of business, and so for me, it's not maybe as grandiose as Elon Musk taking humanity off planet to the stars. But before we get to the stars, we got to solve the Van Allen belt. But and radiation and all that good stuff. I'm not going to go to the moon landing and how 450,000 employees seem to.
No, no, don't. Like, I have to turn
But
off comments. I saw what happened to Candace Owens when she went there.
anyway, um, but in terms of business, the whole idea of building, I mean, getting speaking of gravity and off planet, getting companies out of the gravity well, that is the idea that we take, an immense amount of energy to break free of Earth's gravity and get out into zero G. And we see the same sort of thing in business. And so I love the game of business. And so, I mean, in terms of like, whether it be through accelerators or just truly improving the business models to expand margins and efficiencies. I just think it's so fun. And for me, it takes on a spiritual component now because it's like I feel like I am, and I guess it's probably sort of a second level spiritual component because I feel like I believe that I am using the gifts and abilities that I've been blessed with to do something in terms of business that makes businesses better and thus more profitable, creates more jobs, and especially because of the sorts of businesses that that we're looking at in terms of, especially during this fourth turning with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so when we're creating really healthy products and when we're growing, pun intended, because of the laws here in Oregon, we're growing plant medicines that are truly improving people's lives immensely that have had PTSD or that really needed help with neuroplasticity for whatever reasons. And when we're creating again healthier environments, and I'm not talking about the whole nonsense with climate change and all of that. I'm talking about healthy environments in terms of just the antithesis of that, being great conservationists by making sure that we're replanting when we're cutting down trees, making sure that we're paying attention to genetics when we're growing our herds, making or our crops, that we're not being big ag and using terrible fertilizers and terminator seeds, but instead that we're using permaculture and we're really rotating through with what we're doing with nature, and that we're using, that we're practicing again efficiencies across the board. For me, that takes a there's a spiritual component to that because I get to use my brain and my creativity and my imagination and my personality and the force of my personality sometimes to say we can go here and again harnessing a team towards a distant goal and 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 being a leader versus being a boss in that sense, right? So it's not a matter of I've got this vision and you go there. It's saying no, I can take you from here to here, and just get on board. Let's go, and harnessing those teams together. For me, that is incredibly spiritual because that brings me into that takes me into the same sort of flow state now. A lot of times where time is just gone. That I used to have doing extreme sports all the time.
And then what does that do to your frequency?
Oh, it elevates it like crazy.
Okay.
And it just charges me up. And at the end of the day, it's like, wow, I was up at 4:32, fed the pups, worked out for an hour and a half, did a 40-minute sauna and 3 minutes of cold, and did my meditation during that. And then I went to work 12 hours. And it's the end of the day, and I've been doing nothing but talking. And yeah, I've consumed a couple hundred grams of protein and changed triglycerides and all my vitamins, supplements, and all that stuff during the day. But it's like at the end of 12 or 13 hours, I'm talking faster and I've got more energy and I feel like I'm just in such flow because I'm excited and passionate about what I'm doing. And the whole idea of people are like, well, when I get to X, either X amount or X time in my life, so many turns of the calendar, I'm going to retire. And my thought is like, why would I want to do that? I want to do this for as long as I possibly can when I can be effective and can be efficient because that for me, and if I find other things that I love doing in this sim, so to speak, great. But this is one of the things that I'm really good at, and I love it. So like, why not do that for as long as I possibly can? If you love what you're doing, why would you ever want to retire? And there's definitely a spiritual element that comes into every day of that in terms of the creativity.
Exactly. And I think that you hit on the secret. I mean, that really is when you're living your purpose, you're raising your own frequency by utilizing your talents and abilities and doing it with feeling. You're doing it with passion, with enthusiasm, with joy, with love, right? From a place of love. And so when you do that, it causes a ripple effect to everyone around you. And so we we idolize people like Michael Jordan or Elon Musk who make a big impact and it's very showy. Uh,
Hmm.
and yeah, they do for sure. But I think for the other 99.9999999% of us that might not be as famous or, as godlike in the sense of being legendary, we can make a massive impact by living our purpose. And that's exactly like, so for you, you're finding that spiritual component in building business. And what it's doing is it's bringing you to a higher state every day, which is then going to ripple out to everyone you come in contact with.
Yep.
Whereas so many people, and we've been through these phases where it's like we hate every day, we hate what we're doing, we hate sitting in traffic, we hate the people that we're having to deal with, and it's like that does the opposite. That lowers your frequency to this just miserable place where then that ripples out and affects everyone else.
Yep.
And so when the cliche is about, well, just fix yourself, that's how you fix the world. It's really not a cliche, it's a truth. And I mean, you need to have some framework that's logical. I mean, you can't just say, well, I identify as a giraffe. I mean, there has to
Oyster.
be some connection to reality and to your honest reality of what you are good at, capable of, gifted with, like to do, etc. But yeah, when you do that, and the other thing you said, just the last thing I'll comment on that, like, was you talk to people like, probably startup founders or business owners or whatever. They're like, once I get to X amount, I'll be happy, right? Like from the so many books that I've read, as I imagine you have too, and from talking to people who are what you could consider successful, the reality is you have to be yourself with nothing, and then the money will come. And then it doesn't matter because what matters is being yourself and living your purpose. And that's what raises your frequency to a level of love, joy, peace, and almost enlightenment.
Yep.
Not
Yep.
10, 50, 100, a billy. Like that's not what's going to do it if you're miserable right now, because that means that you're not living who you are supposed to be, right?
Right.
And that's sort of I mean, that to me is at the crux of this issue, though. It seems disconnected, but it's not. Because, like, if we go back to the funny baptism party and Bad Bunny, it's like, and I don't know, like, I'm not judging those people. Maybe they're incredibly happy and incredibly spiritual, but when I sit in a situation like that, it's like all of these people claim to be Catholic, and yet none of them want to talk to me. And like now, I'm the annoying padrino. Like I've done it now a couple times, where it's like, if I'm going to be a padrino for someone who's doing confirmation or communion or a baptism or whatever, well, not a baptism because that's a baby in the Catholic Church, but like before we go and have cake and ice cream and do the whole party thing, like I'm going to talk to you and ask you, like, please tell us about what that means. And it's usually like the kids are excited about it. This is a crazy thing I have found, that the kids get excited about it. The adults feel awkward and like sort of uncomfortable that, oh, we're talking about confirmation and like what that actually means and what it means to be Catholic, and like I don't want to sit around the table and talk about this. I just want to drink and eat cake. But the kids are like, yeah, this is cool, like because they're the ones who actually made the choice to do it. I think you have to set that example. I don't, I'm not even Catholic and I'm doing that, but like I feel like it's the right thing to do, right? And it's like you might not even necessarily like whatever it is in a certain business, but you see the potential of the business, is the right thing to do is for you to use your skills to help them make the business, even though it's like some widget that you don't care about, but you see the market potential and you see how it could impact the world.
Not only that, I find I get true joy out of efficiencies now, out of using the gifts and talents and experiences that I have, and especially from a macro point of view, the whole idea of when in doubt, zoom out. So this is we're kids and looking and saying from a macroeconomic and geopolitical point of view, where is this industry going? Or even more than that, maybe what purpose does this serve and where in the world? Then where is the sector going and where is the industry going? Then where can this company potentially go? and with the whole idea of a rising tide lifts all ships, like are they even in the right, and so applying those macro concepts first, it's the whole idea when we think back to like um, when Cuppy started MGG in Mongolia, right? Where it's like, he goes in and goes, well, we've seen a couple of years of double-digit GDP growth. It's probably going to do well because the rising tide lifts all ships. Maybe. And then you see that in Cambodia as well, where it's like you go in and a year or two after that whole idea in Mongolia, and you go, well, you've got 147 cranes and one stoplight in Phnom Penh. It's a pretty good bet that you got some tailwinds here, right? The rising tide lifts all ships. And so looking and picking the part of the world where for a business, maybe this widget doesn't have a huge life expectancy in whatever jurisdiction they're in right now, but boy, it could sure solve a problem somewhere else. And so again, starting from a really high level and then zooming in and saying, okay, now with all of that in mind, how do we really improve corporate culture? How do we really take executive strategy and gamify that by weaving together SOPs into KPIs? How do we really take a income statement and build it into a forecasting model and then tie that into a Gantt chart? What does that, and then weave that into the gamification? And what does that really mean in terms of the communication? And how do we take our messaging internally and then message it outwardly in terms of our branding, our advertising, our marketing, all sorts of things? And so when you weave those things together from a leader's point of view, you're able to, again, it brings such joy to the process, and it makes you, for me at least, it takes me into this flow state. And so, yeah, I do vibrate at a higher frequency. It does give me more energy, and I think a lot of times energize those around me. And I've been seeing that over the last year or so, even with what we're doing with Mavericks with the meetups. And I mean, yes, we're doing the private equity as well, and the family office stuff, and then all of the structuring, everything that goes into it. Just the meetups alone, though, it's like just hand me a mic and ask me to talk about something, because I at the end of the day, even though I'm talking for hours and hours, sometimes it's like I have more energy at the end of the day than I did at the beginning. Like, how is that possible? And it's just because I'm doing things that I enjoy. I'm getting to share ideas that I really am passionate about, and thus it's like, and the more I do it, the easier it is. So why would you ever want to stop doing that? It's fun.
Well, exactly. And so once you get into like connecting with your true purpose, then it continues to evolve and grow, and you can build on that.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Looks like we're hitting up on 2.5 hours here.
Are we really?
Yeah, we can keep. So I mean, I have only asked you like two of like the 20 questions that I have on my general list. No, that's great. Like we need to like do it in person. I got to figure out how I can do some more stuff in person. But to start with, we'll do it over Zoom. But one question, just to close everything up, that connects with exactly what you were just saying. So, and you might have to think a little bit more abstractly, because I know that this is not exactly necessarily your worldview, but what action step could you give to people of any faith, whether they're Hindu or Christian or Muslim, or they don't profess to have a faith, but they believe in God, or they think we live in a sim, or whatever. What action steps could somebody take, like one thing to change over the next 30 days that they would be able to see, that you think would see positive benefit in their lives? If they just implement this one thing, like, this is one key that if you start here, no matter what your faith is, you're going to find a more rich spiritual journey and, in your life, in the tangible material day to day.
I believe that physical leads. So I said, I believe that the physical leads. The physical leads everything else. That is, when you are in peak physical condition, it's tough to be depressed. And when you are not even peak physical condition, but when you're exercising on a regular basis when you're fueling your body correctly, that is cutting out the ultra high processed crap, sugars, nasty, processed flours, high fructose, all of that junk, and exercising regularly. So again, taking care of the temple of your physical body, when you're doing that to begin with, and also getting off of any big pharma, especially things like SSRIs. So the serotonin, reuptake inhibitors, just terrible. And what they do to the body. I mean, think about it, 90% of them are in the gut, right? That's why you have the mind-gut connection. But allowing those the serotonin 2A receptors to heal, all of those things in terms of the physicality, then take you, so you can do that within 30 days. You can do an incredible cleanse, start exercising, detox, start eating properly, start taking the right sorts of vitamins, higher energy foods, and supplements. All of that is going to lead to an awakening, because it clears your mind. And as you clear you get rid of that brain fog, that allows for the first steps in neuroplasticity.
That's really good. And it's not a answer that anybody else is probably going to give. And I mean, it makes sense that you would say that, though, because that is a massive part of the foundation for everything else, especially in this human journey and this human existence. So that's really good
spans
advice.
the continuum, right? It spans the continuum regardless of the rest of their worldview.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're going to vibrate higher, and you're going to be a better form of yourself, at least that first step.
Right. It requires discipline. It requires like saying no to certain things. It requires saying yes to other things which are maybe less pleasant, saying no to things which are pleasurable but are bad for you. Like it requires a whole host of changes that are more than just physical in order to successfully accomplish it.
Beginning to break addictions. I mean, the addiction to sugar is, proven to be one of the most incredible addictions to break. So going through and beginning to do that, and to see the positive transformation as a man or woman thinks in his or her heart, so are they. As you begin to have that physical transformation, it's how can you help but begin to have a spiritual transformation as well?
It's good stuff, man. I appreciate it. That's been a really fascinating journey, and hopefully we'll have many more of these types of conversations as we get more
awesome.
into the nitty gritty of all of this and sort of figuring it out, and then playing off of this is the Hindu perspective, and I mean then you start to, and the goal isn't to be critical. The goal is to take it higher. It's I mean, that's something that I'm going to bring up now with everybody else that I talk to, and include that as a question when I haven't talked about physicality or exercise or discipline or any of those things, diet, nutrition at all. And yet you're totally right. Like that is something that is absolutely vital, and that's way down on the list when you start to talk about spiritual things and religion, and it shouldn't be. It absolutely, like, your body is your temple, and that's something that should be a core component of your whole framework. So it's good.
Well, 100%. And for us, to really live what we believe, that means that we have to take care of that, because that's where we get the energy from to be the best spiritual beings we can be.
Like and subscribe.